So we're on live now. Good morning, everybody. This is the New Republic show right now. I'm the host, Perry Bacon, and I'm joined today, greatly honored by Brendan Nyhan. He's a professor at Dartmouth, professor of government. And we've known each other a long time now. He's one of the smartest people I look to for insights on politics and policy and really these democracy questions, which he's been really insightful about. If you followed him on Twitter, and now he's on Blue Sky and Twitter, I'm pretty sure. And so I'm Brendan. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Perry. It's great to be with you.
Let me ask a question that I think is like, words matter in a certain sense. I'm a journalist. I care about words. So back in 2020, you would talk to me a lot about when Trump was in power the first time. I would ask you about, is democracy dying or what have you? And you'd say something along the lines of democracy is a continuum. It's not a binary. That was a very useful idea to me, I think to other people as well. And this idea that you would talk about a lot about democratic backsliding or things like that. But are we now in a point where when we talk about the CDC, Lisa Cook, what's happened these last few days, are we now at a point where fascism, dictatorship, authoritarianism, democratic backsliding? I think, what kinds of language do you use when we discuss what's happened these last 6 months?
I do worry that terms like democratic erosion and backsliding don't fully capture what we're seeing. They're euphemistic in a way. They have been the terms of art for countries in situations like this. So scholars like me have defaulted to using them. But in um, in the situation we're seeing now, they use a kind of passive voice. They say the democratic erosion is happening and democratic backsliding is taking place. And that doesn't really capture the one-sided nature of what we're seeing, which is an attempted authoritarian takeover of the American government, with very clear fascist elements that are just right out of textbooks. That doesn't mean that we live in a fascist state. It doesn't mean that we're in a country that's as authoritarian as Putin's Russia, but we should be very clear about what it is we're seeing in the threat. And I do worry that those terms aren't capturing the magnitude of the threat we face.
So the term you just used in this sentence, you used authoritarian and fascist in the last, and just in your response. So we're there now. Like we are living it in now.
100%. And the scholars who study these processes around the world have really been taken aback by how quickly this has proceeded. In many other countries, when people compare how long it took for someone like Erdogan in Turkey or Orban in Hungary to consolidate control over independent institutions, it often taken much longer, right? To undermine the independence of the central bank in Turkey took much longer. It took much longer for Orban to weaken the institutions that check government power in Hungary. We're 7 months in, and while the lower courts still seem resilient, the states seem resilient. Congress is supine. The Supreme Court has often been an enabler. The media is fairly quiescent. Civil society and protests have been limited at best. So I'm more pessimistic than I was a few months ago.
You're more pessimistic than a few months ago, and I was going to ask you why, but you sort of laid it out as like you gave a bunch of institutions, and I don't want to go through each one of them, but I guess why has there not been more institutional resistance? I'll just ask broadly.
It's a great question. We know that resistance to authoritarianism is a kind of coordination game. People's incentives to engage in it are greater the more that other people are engaged in resistance as well. And what we've seen is failures to coordinate in the acts of resistance. Each institution, each person may be making what is narrowly a rational decision to go along, to make a deal, to resign, right? And we've seen that from universities, we've seen that from law firms, we've seen that from government officials again and again and again. They make what is narrowly a rational, self-interested decision, but one that has devastating consequences for American democracy when accumulated across our entire society and our entire system of government. So I worry very much about that dynamic continuing to play out. It's dangerous because it can become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. When you see other people fail to resist, you, of course, become more likely to do so in the future. And those people who might speak out, those people who might voice opposition, who might resist, are less likely to do so. So I was encouraged in a way to see the CDC director refuse to resign, to force the Trump administration to fire her. I was thrilled to see Lisa Cook refuse to passively accept Trump's attempt to fire her and to say instead, no, this is illegal. Um, the question is whether those kinds of actions will just be kind of blips along the way, or we'll see other individuals and institutions standing up in the same fashion.
You made some international comparisons a bit ago. So you said it wasn't this fast in in other countries. Is that sort of broadly true? Is that usually, because on some level, are we in the fifth year or the first year? I guess is a important question. But in some ways, let's say the first year for now. So so it's seven. It usually takes longer than 7 months for everything to fall apart.
Even in the second term. So they're right.
Yeah.
There has been this pattern that people have commented on that it's really the second time in government when aspiring authoritarians learn how to pull the levers of power and learn how to undermine the checks on their authority. So in that way, Trump fits a kind of pattern that we've seen, for instance, with Orban. But nonetheless, the speed of it is quite striking, especially because Trump is unusually unpopular for the leaders who've tried this playbook. That's what's one of the things that's so striking about this moment. When we've seen authoritarians try to challenge the limits on their power, they're often overwhelmingly popular, right? They're using the force of public support to say we should rewrite our constitution, we should override our laws, and so forth. We haven't seen that here. Trump continues to be a quite unpopular president the same way he was his first term. The fact that he clearly won in 2024 seems to have, and the fact that he won despite everything that had been made public about him, I think uh, created this kind of perception that there was some sort of mandate around him. But the public opinion polling isn't consistent with that at all. It's true he did defeat Kamala Harris, but he still won what was a relatively narrow reelection victory and returned to being a president with around 40% approval, which is not some overwhelming mandate for overturning the American system of government. And yet here we are.
It's interesting you said that because I do feel like in November, December, I, a journalist, did feel it's like he won we've been saying for a long time, Republicans are trying to pursue this minority rule strategy. They don't have popular support. The last time they won a popular election was 2004. So even someone left leaning, very anti-Trump, left that being like, okay, he has the mandate. But I think the polling has become a little bit more clear. In February, you could make a case maybe he had more of a mandate, but I think he's now back to 2019 polling fairly quickly, right?
100%. And you can think of this as kind of two different timelines that are proceeding, and it's unclear which will win out. Mark Koplovich, who's a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, talks about it being a kind of authoritarian speed run in the kind of video game sense, where he's trying to consolidate authoritarian power, even as the normal processes of American politics are making him more unpopular. That's typically the pattern that we see, right? When people actually hold office, they tend to become more unpopular. They tend to lose ground, for instance, in the midterm elections. And so Trump's speed is in some ways a requirement because, of course, he's going to become more unpopular. We're seeing backlash against him, for instance, in the public's views on immigration, where there's been what we typically call a thermostatic backlash against him, where people are now expressing more favorable views on immigration. They're calling for less harsh and punitive approaches of the sort that compared to what he's undertaken. So that countervailing pressure is going to build and grow. If the Democrats take back the House, of course, there will be some kind of institutional check within Congress, which has been entirely supine
Right.
to this point. And of course, a term limited president. Now he continues to suggest that he will override or ignore the 22nd Amendment as a kind of joke, but uh, that will further create pressure on him and weaken his position. So that's why this moment is so critical, because we know public opinion is going to be trending against him. We know lame duck dynamics will harm him, but and that's why he's trying to consolidate power over all these institutions. Now, of course, it's not as carefully thought out as that in the kind of addled nature of his thinking, but he is very instinctive, and he does have smart people around him who are, I'm sure, thinking about those kinds of trends.
I got a group sent me a poll about Trump 2028, and they asked the public, "What do you think about Trump trying to run for a third term or what have you?" And the views were fairly negative, even among Republicans. That's not surprising. I was struck by because I wasn't sure if I should write about the poll or not. Is that how are we in discussing Trump wanting to run for a third term? Are we I don't love the phrase normalizing, but is it important to like avoid even suggesting that's possible, or is it necessary to discuss because it's a possibility because this is what dictators do?
Yeah, it's a very hard question. This is I mean, as a journalist, I'm sure you've thought about this. This is a kind of ongoing dilemma that we face across a whole number of actions. Um, to treat illegal or unconstitutional actions as matters of debate, um, may normalize them in the way you're suggesting. At the same time, we can't pretend that those kinds of things aren't happening or that those ideas aren't circulating. So, I think it's important to be clear that there is a genuine prospect of a challenge to the 22nd Amendment, which would, make at least part of the Constitution a dead letter, given the impossibility of amending it according to existing procedures. So that's a very big deal. If part of our Constitution itself is directly overridden. Um, at the same time, um, if we simply treat it as a matter of dispute between the parties, right, then it just falls into this category of things that Democrats and Republicans disagree on. And that's the worry I have. I don't think media headlines are as all powerful as critics on social media make them out to be.
Sure.
But I do think it's important to convey this is abnormal. This is
Yes.
outside the scope of what's possible. When you ask people in polls about things like should politicians follow court orders, they overwhelmingly say yes.
Right.
So if the question were phrased as should we follow the Constitution, actually, I think
That's fair. That's a good point.
most Americans will say yes.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, when we treat every legal and constitutional barrier as up for grabs, then of course that just increases the incentive for Trump to challenge them, and that's the pattern that we've seen so many times, and that's why we're seeing a greater pushback. For instance, with the Lisa Cook case that you alluded to, where um, people are calling for the media to say Trump attempted to fire her.
Mm.
Right? The courts have not weighed in on this. It's not actually clear whether she has been legally fired or not, and as opposed to saying she has been fired, and that creates a kind of status quo, where she's trying to undo her firing, right? We know that those kinds of framings can really have important consequences, and we have to insist on the law and the Constitution because, as people have said in lots of different ways, the law is not self-enforcing,
Right.
right? It only binds us to the extent that we perceive it binds us, and that's in a way its own kind of giant coordination game. The media, the press, the opposition party, the judges, law enforcement, everyone treats the law as if it is binding. And we're seeing Trump in so many ways trying to dissolve or weaken those bonds, and we have to fight against that.
I hope people are listening, and I want to emphasize is how much Brendan is talking about institutions and people. It's not just the Democrats should do X, and nothing drives me more crazy. And I'm going to come back to what the Democrats should do, but we are trying to defend the constitutional system. It is not about one party, and it should not. It is partisan because the Republicans are led by the authoritarian, and I don't want to deny that. But the defense of democracy should not be up to one party or one group of congressmen or one group of governors. Let me come back to you mentioned institutions earlier. So there's been a lot of, what part of what Trump is doing is really attacking higher education, attacking academia, calling it too left. Like in this moment, like what you don't sound too pro-Trump. Like talk about the role you see higher education and academia should be playing in this moment in America.
It's
Scholars
a good
like you,
question.
yeah,
Oh, so scholars like me. Well, so I think it's important for us to speak out, and especially those of us who study politics and democracy to make clear the nature of the threat. This is something that scholars take very seriously. They're highly alarmed, and what we're seeing for a long time was contested. It wasn't. There were a lot of disagreements among scholars about the extent and magnitude of the threat, especially in the first term, where Trump would say lots of things that were authoritarian. but he acted on many fewer of them. And it wasn't really until the aftermath of 2020 election leading up to January 6th that we kind of saw those tendencies come to their full fruition. Coming into his second term, I think there was even greater concern, but and yet still scholars wondered about the magnitude of the threat, the constraints that Congress might pose, the constraints that the courts might pose. The institutions that I've been focusing on so heavily, though, have turned out to be weak, and so I do think it's important for um, scholars to kind of sound the alarm and say this will shape the kind of democracy that we have and the rule of law that we enjoy in this country, not just for ourselves but for our children and grandchildren. We know institutions are very sticky. They're persistent, right? And when they change, it can be often hard to undo the damage that takes place. So I really think it's incumbent on us to say, as scholars, that what's happening here is really worrisome. Now, of course, everyone who has a critical perspective on what's happened in higher ed over the last 10 plus years, we can litigate that all day. It's a complicated issue. Um, I'm happy to talk about it. But honestly, in a certain sense, to me, it's beside the point.
It's
Authoritarians have always attacked higher education.
right.
So we ought to be able to hold two ideas in our head at the same time. The first is higher education is far from perfect, and there are many problems in it. We can talk about how to address those.
Yeah.
But authoritarians have always found some reason to object to what's happening in higher education and have always tried to bring universities to heel because they offer a kind of independent counterweight to the claims that are being made and the authority that's being exercised. The one last thing I'll say, Perry, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, is one kind of dog that hasn't barked in this whole moment is mass protest. And to the extent that there has been mass protest, it's been led by very old people, which is historically, I'm not an expert on protest movements, but my understanding is they're typically much more youth driven. And with everything around Israel and Gaza, the issues around Trump in the United States have just not been front and center. But that's meant that universities have played, I think, a smaller role in that sense than they might have in a world where Israel Gaza wasn't so central to what's being debated on college
That's
campuses.
interesting. Let me think about that. I hadn't thought about it that way. Talk about so let me follow up on the scholars should be sounding the alarm. How do you avoid the scholars are being partisan? Or this is where we are now. You're not trying to be partisan, but defending democracy happens to align with one party right now.
Um, yeah, it's a difficult question. I think my colleagues take their nonpartisanship in their professional roles very seriously. Um, I'm one of the co-directors, as you know, of this group called Brightline Watch that surveys political science experts around the United States, and I would encourage folks listening um, to look back at our reports and to see how experts have evaluated the state of democracy going back to 2017. What was most striking to me was the kind of judicious nature of their evaluations of democracy during Trump's first term. There were things they saw that they evaluated as alarming, threatening to democracy, et cetera. But when we asked them to rate American democracy overall, there was never a sky is falling moment. Those ratings of American democracy overall during Trump's first term were actually quite stable.
I looked it up. They were in the 70s. Is that right? Most of the time, like if you
Between 60 and 70 on this 0 to 100 scale.
yeah, I think it's
So
important.
not perfect, right? But well ahead of Brazil and Israel and other kinds of countries that have been right around that threshold between democracy and autocracy, right? And so in the whole first term, political scientists, when asked to evaluate American democracy, did not say the sky is falling under Trump. But even in our most recent survey, which was completed in April, we saw an unprecedented decline in scholars' evaluation. So to me, that suggests they're not just simply saying, I disagree with Trump on policy or I don't support his party. They're really seeing something different. And we're about to conduct another survey, so we'll see how they've updated their valuations. You can, of course, always accuse people of partisanship. It's a kind of cheap and lazy tactic. I mean, it's no secret that most professors in their party registration are Democrats, et cetera. And, again, we can talk about the problems with that. I wish we had, a more politically diverse group set of experts, but more politically diverse set of experts. But there's, I don't think there's anything especially complicated about what's happening now, and I don't know that partisanship. You don't need a partisan lens to see that when troops are occupying the nation's capital and mass men are kidnapping people off the street, that you should be worried about authoritarianism. Like if you've cracked the history book once or twice, you don't even need much expertise to recognize what we're seeing.
Well, this is my field, not mine, but you wrote a column for Columbia Journalism Review for a period, as people don't know that. So I want to ask you what the media should be doing. And I want to preface this by saying I don't, I'm on Blue Sky these days more than Twitter because it helps. It doesn't suppress links among other things. Because links are matter for journalists. But I find the sort of micro analysis of New York Times headline X or New York Times 17th paragraph Z to be a little annoying. We're not in a world in which the New York Times. Unfortunately, we're in a world where the average American or the average American never read the New York Times, and now we're in a world where a lot of people are reading a lot of different things. But my critique might be that the media maybe is not connecting the dots in a certain way. Lisa Cook, National Guard, CDC, these are all the same story of authoritarianism. Not that would be my complaint would be, and that's the media writ large, and even sort of some left media, if you watch it, is a little bit alarmist without being connective-ish. That's my critique. What do you think the journalists, the sort of media role should be right now?
No, that's a great point, and I think um, you're right to be skeptical about the importance of the exact wording used in the New York Times because of the way audience segmentation takes place, and just in general, media effects are typically much more limited than people would expect. Um, with that said, though, I do think it's important in general for the media beyond the New York Times to help people understand how these events are interrelated, because we do see this pattern of kind of episodic coverage, right? Trump did something, and it's obviously pretextual if you understand what he's been doing overall. But the nature of how journalists understand objectivity, even now, they're writing stories that have a kind of premise that there's something valid or legal taking place.
Let's
So
microanalyze the crime data in Chicago or DC, for example.
right, right. Let's pretend he's serious and have a serious conversation about the pretextual action being taken
Yes.
and the ostensible rationale for it. Right. Uh, Lisa Cook's mortgage application details are just absurd. They're obviously looking for a basis to remove her, to even debate the details of that when it's so obviously a kind of cooked up, targeted investigation. I think is a real failing. So putting these things in that larger context and helping people see that there's this ongoing attack on independent institutions, on critics of the administration, on the constraints of the rule of law. I do think it's critical. It's very hard to write about because it feels like taking a side.
Okay.
And that's I think both to readers on the audience side and to journalists who've been steeped in those norms that about from working in so many newsrooms. But the question I always ask is, what would you say if you saw it in another country? And I think if you look
You
at
say that a
foreign
lot, actually. I
report,
want to know people note that. This is something he says on Twitter all the time. What would you see if it happened in another country? And I do think that's a great comparison. If the conservative in Britain sent the troops to London, what would you think? You think, oh dear, it's authoritarianism, dictatorship. What should happen? Happen. That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, and the reporting on those other countries is much clearer. So when John Bolton's house was raided by the
Yes.
FBI, John Bolton, former Trump national security advisor turned critic, um, we don't know the details of the investigation and so forth. But again, obviously political. People in the Trump administration immediately tweeting about it, like as the vehicles are literally in his driveway. Um, and I was just comparing the way that story was being covered with the way the New York Times covered raids on opposition figures in Russia,
Yes.
where
Very directly.
they were much clearer about what was happening, right? When Putin wants to crack down on his opposition, investigators go into the houses of these folks and try to find things in order to bring charges against them. And if you turn over everyone's life, you can typically find things.
Yes.
That's the nature of power and the rule of law. We really depend on people exercising a kind of judiciousness about how they apply the law. but if you apply it in an arbitrary way, you can usually find things. So, even if it turns out
Young
John
Bolton.
Bolton technically violated the law, Lisa Cook
No,
technically
that's what it is. Right, right. You're
violated
right.
the
Yes.
law, right? Does anyone seriously think that the Trump administration is concerned about the security of classified documents, um, or making accurate representation on in lending practices? Like, these are preposterous, right? These standards have not been applied to the president of the United States himself in painfully obvious ways. So, um, uh, yeah. So I just worry about granting the premise of these pretextual things, and again, it's a challenging issue because people want to talk about those. Like, crime is an issue that we should talk about. The state of higher education is an issue
Yes.
we should talk about. Like, we can go on down the list. But you're kind of doing authoritarians' work for them if you transform their pretextual actions into a kind of good faith debate or action that has positive motives for society.
You mentioned the courts and Congress as not, and I think that might be, a failure of James Madison's imagination, or like a better way. Like, in some ways, the courts and Congress are not checking Trump because they're not defending their institutions; they're defending their party in a certain way, right?
At least the Supreme Court. I would say the lower courts have acquitted
Lower courts,
themselves
right?
generally
Yeah.
very well. Not entirely, but overall, we're seeing judges defending the rule of law across party lines. We're seeing Trump appointed judges say, the actions you're taking are illegal. I told you to do something and you failed to do it, and so forth. So
This is an
I mean,
important thing he's saying here. Make sure that people understand is, like, on the lower, particularly the district court level, Trump-appointed judges are often saying he's exceeding his power, which then appeals courts, and often the Supreme Court particularly is overturning things. Even conservative judges think he's exceeding his powers, which is, to make sure. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And those higher level courts are making it difficult to give force to those decisions. That they're taking a long time to act. They're failing to issue injunctions that prevent the Trump administration from moving forward, which of course changes the status quo in fundamental ways. So you can litigate things and come back 5 years later and say, "Oh, actually, what they did was illegal," but all the damage has been done.
Right.
So if you're failing to stop these actions now, it's not clear how much can be recovered later. So the courts, I worry, and the courts are under intense pressure, up to and including personal threats to their lives and to judges' lives and to their family members. We've seen a number of judges getting pizzas delivered to their home to indicate that they know where they live. We've seen those pizzas be addressed to the dead relative of a judge who was murdered by someone who came to their house. Really horrible things are happening to try to um, dissuade them from standing up to this administration. Congress has almost entirely abdicated its role. If you're thinking about what the founders got wrong, um, the most fundamental thing besides failing to anticipate political parties is failing to anticipate that Congress wouldn't defend its prerogative. They thought Congress would zealously guard the powers given to it in Article 1. And instead, we've seen the opposite. The Trump administration basically claiming the power to dictate federal spending, which is a power um, explicitly granted in the Constitution to Congress. And under those conditions, if you get that, is the ultimate trump card of Congress. That is the leverage it needs if used appropriately to check the executive branch. With a Republican Congress and so many of the more Trump skeptical politicians either standing down or leaving office entirely, uh, they've done almost nothing. Now we'll see if the Democrats take the House back, how that plays out. Congress, uh, you know, does provide a platform they could use to challenge the administration more, but there's only so much you could do with one chamber.
So I'll move to the Democrats now. If you're on Blue Sky, you see a lot of, why aren't the Democrats standing up? Why aren't they doing more? And and I think I want to discuss, because on some level, politicians' job is to defend the democracy of the country. They swear an oath to defend democracy, and they should say that thing when illegal actions are happening, they should certainly say that. And part of their job is that. At the same time, part of their job, if you're a politician, the opposition party, is to win elections. And there might be an extent to where talking about jobs is more helpful than talking about Lisa Cook or or John Bolton. And so talk about that. Like, in other words, what I'm trying to say is the Democratic Party is not the only agent in defending democracy, and Brendan and Perry are not responsible for winning swing districts, but candidate X or Roy Cooper or Sherrod Brown is responsible for winning a swing state. So our roles are different. So talk about how you feel about the discourse with the Democrats.
It's a great question. I think people over-index on the exact messaging approaches used by Democrats, especially in a top-down way. There's no magic message that will fix this. Um, the Democratic Party is going through a kind of transition between its prior form as a kind of coalition of moderates and liberals to a more explicitly liberal party. And that has created a factional divide that has turned out to be a huge vulnerability for the American political system. If you're thinking about things we didn't fully understand, the weakness of the Republican Party, which allowed Trump to take it over, turned out to be really critical. The unwillingness of the Republican Party once Trump had become president or the presidential nominee in waiting to challenge him and defend the Constitution, the rule of law, turned to be vulnerability. But another key vulnerability has been that the Democratic Party has been struggling with these internal factional divides now. That doesn't make it their fault. What has been done has been overwhelmingly done by Trump and his Republican allies. But it does mean there's a kind of vulnerability there. And I guess the only way out there is through. Parties go through these kinds of processes. I don't think anyone's going to magically invent the secret message that's going to fix the Democrats' image problems. There's a search for the magic message, or the Joe Rogan of the left, or all these
Right.
various kind of fantastical scenarios that people bandy around. I don't think any of that is likely to happen. Change happens in moments like these from the bottom up. People see what messages work and they're elevated, right? That's exactly how Barack Obama came out of nowhere in the aftermath of 2004, when there was a similar kind of level of disenchantment in the Democratic base. So I would expect new figures to emerge and the party to reconfigure around those. The problem in the meantime, though, is there needs to be a democracy left for them to contest in future elections. And so many people are paralyzed by the latest messaging memo that they're failing to defend the institutions of democracy and the rule of law. The joke I make, with some sadness inside, is people being dragged away to the camp saying, but what about the price of eggs? Like, at some point, you just have to defend democracy, even if it's not the optimal message. So this is not something that's strictly up to Democrats. It's not about Democrats as such. They happen to be the opposition party right now, though, and if they fail to contest Trump consolidating power over institutions, they may find themselves in a much more difficult position in the future, even though they happen to have a more optimal message at that moment. If Trump has rigged the game 7 different ways, we've seen in other countries, it can be very hard for the opposition party to resist under those circumstances.
The party stuff you talked about at the beginning of that answer. Let me ask a different way. In 2021, I think I wrote a piece when I was at the Post still, arguing there were sort of 4 parties stuck in 2 systems. So we had the AOC Bernie Sanders party, the Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi party, let's go with that for now, the Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney party, and the Donald Trump party. And I wonder, maybe I was wrong then, but it seems to be the Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, Mitt Romney party has died functionally, and there's one Republican Party, and there's 2 really warring, big, strong factions on the Dem side. Is that right?
More or less, that's how the factional stuff has played out. I don't think that's how the landscape would look if we had a functioning multi-party system, though. So I just want to kind of draw out what you just said, because I think it's really important for people to think about. If and when we get through this, many political scientists, including myself, think a multi-party system with rules that encourage the creation of a relatively small number of parties, but more than 2, would be quite valuable. Lee Drutman is the person who's written the most about this and how it could happen. Um, in a world where you have 4 or 5 major parties of the sort that you were describing, Perry, that could allow for a center right party to be electorally viable in a way that's not now. It's just too hard to win primaries, especially with Trump going after you. Um, but those folks could have an independent base of support. They would have the option to enter coalitions with the center left party. Those folks, in turn, would have, by virtue of the opportunity to coalition with that center right party, they'd have some leverage with the left party on their opposite flank. And that would also break down the kind of zero sum dynamics that are so poisonous in our politics, where every compromise is seen as aiding the other side, every concession is seen as a kind of zero sum capitulation. Um, how we get there from here is not clear. We can get into the weeds on the procedural obstacles, but I think that would be a better system. And it's worth contrasting our current system with that one just to see how challenging the two-party system is under these conditions of very, very high polarization, where the Democratic Party in particular just spans a huge range of folks. And those coalitional dynamics have proven to be incredibly difficult to manage. Obama inspired a lot of unity, but in the period since, the Democrats have not found their footing in a way that lets them prioritize, democracy, right? I mean, in a way, if I can just say one thing, Perry, like, um, I encourage folks to reflect on this moment, who fall on the Democratic side in the following sense. Many people on the Democratic side lamented how Republicans were not prioritizing democracy and making choices about who to support, in making choices about how they voted, right? They were prioritizing party and policy over democracy in backing Donald Trump. The act is not the same, but nonetheless, it is true that I see actions that I interpret as primarily oriented around the factional divide within the Democratic Party, and that prioritize that divide over opposing a very serious threat to American democracy. And I would encourage folks to reflect on that parallel and to really think carefully, regardless of which side you are on of that factional divide, about whether it's worth the risks you're running, because they're very real, and you could win a kind of Pyrrhic victory where your faction gains control of the Democratic Party, but it inhabits a landscape of competitive authoritarianism where it can't run in free and fair elections, and that's certainly within the realm of the possibilities we confront right now.
Any final thoughts? That was depressing enough to where there's nothing really positive to say, is what I think in a certain sense. I mean, I guess the one thing that's maybe positive to say is that it's better to face an authoritarian who's unpopular than one who's popular. I assume this is the one thing, is like, it's not as if Trump has done all this crazy stuff and he's at 70%. The moves he's making appear to, like, as far as I know, I read economic data some. Not I'm not the expert on this, but I mean, we think Trump has become more unpopular in part because of what he's done on the democracy front, or a lack thereof, right? It's not, we haven't had a recession. The economy has ups and downs. The tariffs have not been good, but the reason Trump is unpopular, we certainly know that what Trump is doing is not popular. It may be the case what Trump is doing is actually making him more unpopular, correct?
Yeah, yeah, it's
One of those
plausible.
people.
And the economy is in a recession, but it's tepid. It
Yeah.
and potentially sliding towards greater weakness. So he's he's vulnerable. And one thing we know is that these divisions are often too stark. Your weakness on the economy bleeds into your weakness on other issues, and vice versa. So when you become weak as a politician, you become vulnerable all at once, right, across a spectrum of issues. And we've seen that when institutions and people stand up to this administration, they often succeed. In many cases, they will give up. Trump is a kind of classic bully going around seeing who will give him what he wants, right? And when there's resistance, they often move on to the next target. So I do think I do think that greater resistance may breed greater success. And especially as these dynamics we described earlier go on, and public opinion likely turns further against Trump. Even undoing the damage that's taken place at this point would be a monumental task. But I don't think there's anything inevitable here. And even as though the trajectory is negative, I don't think anyone thinks we're going to be in Putin's Russia tomorrow. So every little bit helps in terms of stabilizing and preserving democracy and the rule of law. You should think of this the way climate scientists say every little bit of warming averted is positive, even though they talk about these thresholds and they say, well, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And sometimes that can be demobilizing to people when we cross a threshold. But what they tell us is every bit of warming averted is valuable. And I would say the same thing about democracy and the rule of law. Every little bit of preservation that we can inspire or achieve is valuable, and that's something that I hope is at least less depressing, if not exactly hopeful.
That's a great place to end on. I'm going to plug Brendan. He's on Twitter. He's on Blue Sky. You should check out the Bright Line Watch if you haven't. It's a good. They come out every few months. It's a good measure of a lot of scholars thinking about democracy. You also poll the public, and so I think that's a very helpful metric people have. Anything else you want to plug that I should mention before we close up here?
No, Perry Bacon. You should read his stuff. It's
All right.
fantastic.
I appreciate that. Good to see you. Thank you. Thanks
All
everybody for
right, you
joining
too.
us. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone.